So at this point, we've had a chance to start to collect our pictures into our midterm portfolio through the use of ratings and a smart collection. So once we've gotten down to the pictures that we really want to work with, what we're going to start to do now is to develop the photos. We want to do this after we've gotten to the pictures we want, because what ends up happening is it takes time to go through and to actually adjust each of these pictures and to work on them. And so we don't want to spend a lot of time working on pictures that we're never going to use. So it's a good idea after we've imported to narrow all of our pictures to get down to the ones that we really like and then start to do some work on them to improve them. Okay, so we're going to start to get inside of Lightroom here. Everything we've done so far has been in this section here, which is called the library. So, and over here on the left, you can see that we're in the midterm portfolio, right? So I've got 43 images now inside of that collection. So what we're going to do is we're now going to move into this other module inside of Lightroom, which we haven't talked about yet at all. So right up here next to library, there's one that says develop. And so we're going to click on that. And when we click on develop, it's going to switch kind of some of the parts of the screen. So our left-hand side now, instead of having things like collections, has things like presets and history. And then down lower, it's got our collections. So we can still switch between different sets of photos. And then, but what's mainly changed is this right-hand column over here. And if for whatever reason, if you're ever not seeing any one of the top, the bottom, the right, or the left, there is a toggle switch here, which will hide or show permanently that, that panel. So if I have that turned off, which gives me more space, when I come over here, it will appear, but otherwise it's going to hide. So sometimes that might not be working. You're like, oh, my panel's not there. It's just that this little toggle switch needs to be clicked. So same thing down here. This one can be turned on and off as well. So what we're going to start with is we're going to work in this first category here today, which is called the basic. Okay, so this will give us most of the controls we need to just do our kind of straightforward editing. Okay, so I'm just on a picture here. This one has not been edited previously. I can tell that by this little badge down here. So this says that it's a part of a collection, but then also here, this would indicate that this picture has already been worked on. So like if I click there, if I hit the backslash, which is right above the return key, it will show the before and then the after, right? So if you can kind of toggle that on and off to see the difference in what changes you've made to your picture, right? And we're not looking for like crazy changes to our picture. We're looking to just do an enhancement. We're looking to make the picture a little bit better than what it came out of the camera, right? The camera does a good job, and we've spent a lot of time working on getting a good exposure. And I've purposely not shown you this part until now because I wanted to have you put the pictures up on the website as they came out of the camera. And there's a lot that we can do to brighten and darken and change things about it. And if I was trying to look at, well, how did you shoot this inside the camera? Then if you had the opportunity to brighten them, we wouldn't know whether or not you were getting the correct exposure. So now we're starting to move past that, and so it's time to start looking at, well, how can we make our pictures even better? We still start with a good exposure, but now we can start to enhance them. Okay. So I'll go back to this picture just because it hasn't already been previously worked on. Sometimes it's also nice to work inside of here with inside of full screen, so it will just enlarge this ever so slightly. I am going to go ahead and hide these two panels because I don't necessarily need them as I'm in here working. So that'll just make my picture a little bit bigger as I start to look at it. So the strategy of how you go about working on an image is really kind of dependent on what you see in the picture. So if I look here and I go, oh, well, you know, I think that the first thing, you know, the color actually looks pretty good to me. I may not necessarily want to change the color. We talked about white balance. So depending on how we shot the as shot, that would set it at whatever white balance we previously had done. So I can go in here and I could adjust it kind of more yellow or more blue. You know, I could make it a little more green or magenta. If I bring in magenta, magenta is red and blue, so I could take out some of that blueness and make it more red if I bring up yellow, right? But I'm not looking for crazy color. After I've messed these up, though, I could go back and I could choose as shot, right? So then it would switch back to whatever my color was previously. you notice here too, there's also things like shade or, sunlight, which will give us subtle changes, same as what would have happened had we had chosen these when we were inside of our camera. So I'll go back to as shot. So we could work with the white balance there. The next section really is probably where I'll start with the most, which is tone. So the first slider is exposure, which is probably the most important slider. So I'll go ahead and start there, and I might decide, do I want this a little bit lighter or a little bit darker? So as I start to brighten, right, it's bringing up all the values, right? Now, there's certain things about that I really like, right? I mean, so this is a reflection picture, and it's actually upside down. So the way that sometimes your pictures come in, or they might be uploading to Weebly, and they're coming in not as verticals, but they're coming in as horizontals. So you may want to actually make that change inside of Lightroom first. So if you hold the Command key and you use the bracket keys, which are right next to the P, I could rotate that around. So there's the picture as it was shot. And with these reflections, I've been liking them upside down. And so I'm starting to see more of these rocks that are through the water, but I'm blowing out the clouds, right? So I probably don't want to bring up exposure that high. I might only want to bring it up just a hair, just to kind of brighten it up a little bit. So contrast is going to change that difference between light and dark. So I could, make there more contrast, making the blacks blacker and the whites whiter, or everything kind of graying out a little bit. In this case, I think the contrast is already okay, so I'm going to probably leave it set to 0. The next slider is highlight. So this whole section here is going to allow me, similar to exposure, but it's going to allow me to affect either just the highlights or just the shadows in different cases. So I do like some of that darkness coming out of these rocks. So I'm going to start with shadows here, and I'm going to try to brighten up the shadows a little bit. So I'm going to bring that to the right-hand side, and that makes my shadows a little bit brighter. Right now I'm starting to see more of those rocks than I did before, right? If I bring it this way, that's going to go darker. But when I do that, I do have a tendency to lose some of the black. So what I can actually do is take this blacks one and start to bring that back down. So I start to get in this top part over here, I start to get some of that black that I was starting to lose, but I've also brightened up some of those shadows. And if I want to check and see, well, did that make any difference? I can simply hit the backslash key and see that's what it looked like before. And so those rocks, especially in this top corner up here, I can definitely see it better, but I'm holding some of the black, up in this area here. So I think that's an improvement. And so then with the shadows, I've already adjusted that one. So the inverse of that is kind of the highlights. So I might want to either brighten the highlights or darken the highlights. So if I want them brighter, that's going to make those clouds a little bit whiter, give them a little bit more pop, but I might start to lose some of the area there. If I take highlights and I bring highlights down, then I actually get a little more detail kind of down in here, some separation, and it holds on to that blue a little bit better, which might actually be the best option for me. With whites, I could also just take those whites and start to brighten up the whites now that I've held down those highlights a little bit, or I could darken the whites. So I might just give it just a little bit to enhance its overall contrast. Okay. And again, I can check and see, okay, yeah, it's, making a subtle difference as I make that, that change between those highlights, shadows. Then the next one is part of this section, which is called presence. So clarity is going to give us kind of a sharpness to it. It's also going to change contrast a little bit. So I do end up using a little bit of clarity on a lot of the pictures. So that's why I also have a tendency to not use contrast, because the clarity is already going to add some contrast as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start to bring this up a little bit, and we should see that this starts to get sharper, 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 all the way up into here. Now for me, this is getting way too kind of contrasty and sharp. So I don't usually use clarity at 100%. I might use it at more like, 20 or so. But you'll notice if I bring it all the way down here, look how soft and kind of blurry it can become. Now that might be a different effect, or if I'm doing skin smoothing or something like that, I might use clarity all the way down. But in this case, I'm going to give it, I want a little more sharpness. I'm just going to come up a tiny bit, maybe around like the 30 range, just to, again, you can see that sharpness, and it just, comes up a little bit. It has increased my highlights a little bit, so I might bring my highlights, back down just a tiny bit, and maybe bring back down my whites just to kind of counteract some of that value change that happened inside of that contrast. Also, the blacks went a little blacker, so I might be able to bring the black back up just a tiny bit. Then the other two here are vibrance and saturation. So they do very similar things. Both are dealing with how strong is the color. But the vibrancy has a tendency to shift the blues and the greens a lot more than the saturation. Not that it won't affect them, but saturation will affect much more the reds and the oranges and the yellows than like the blues and the greens. Also, saturation, if I take saturation all the way out, will make it grayscale, right? So notice if I start with saturation and I take this all the way to the left-hand side, I basically have a black and white image. Now, this isn't the way that I would make a black and white image, but in effect, it has turned it into a black and white picture. We'll talk later about how to do black and white. If I bring that back up to the middle point and instead take down saturation, it's going to lose most of the color, although there is still some hint of kind of value inside of here. And we don't have a lot of reds and yellows, so the reds and yellows would definitely stand out when we took out vibrancy. So instead, if I went in the other direction, right, if I go this way, look at how much blue and green we've gotten in that picture. And a little bit of yellow is starting to show up kind of in this area, right? And definitely some in kind of these trees that are here. If I bring that back down to center and instead take saturation and bring saturation up, again, it's going to make everything brighter. It did pick up a little bit more kind of red and yellow inside of here. And so there are occasions where I might want to do kind of a mix of the two. So there's a lot of times that I might take saturation down a little bit and maybe bring vibrancy up. And I'm not going to bring vibrancy up that far. You could bring both of the sliders up. It really kind of depends on the look or the effect that you're going for. But I want the blues to be kind of nice and saturated and colorful, like a nice blue sky. But I also don't want it to be overwhelming or unrealistic. I think there's plenty of other things going on in the picture that don't feel normal. And so I think really crazy color is going to kind of take away from that and make it kind of a little too garish. So I'm just going to be kind of subtle with the color, but we want there to be a pop, right? I mean, that was kind of the color before, and there's the color now. And what we're looking to is just to kind of amp it up a little bit, just raise that color intensity a little bit. But again, I'm not looking for, for this, right? We see, especially when you're first learning and trying stuff out, people want to go way too far, right? And that's just like crazy color. We don't need that at all. So it's just a matter of just these subtle shifts just to give it a little bit of an enhancement of color. So there we go. So there are other adjustments that we can do inside of here, and we'll talk about each of these kind of in later sections of our class. But for right now, we're just going to focus. There's plenty that we can do just alone in this basics panel. So we'll just start with that without going deeper into some of the other tonal curves or split toning or HSL or looking at effects and camera calibration. And then there's also a whole other set of buttons up here that will allow us to do other modifications. So there's plenty more that we can do inside this develop module, but for now we just want to focus on just looking at how can we increase it a little bit, how can we make an improvement, and you can see we're not looking for crazy, we're just looking for enhanced photos. Let's look at one other example down here that has a different range of color. So let's look maybe at this one where there's a lot more greens and reds and yellows, so that we can maybe see how that hue, saturation, vibrancy difference maybe plays out a little bit differently. So again, the first thing I'm going to look at is overall, color and exposure. So to me, the color is actually already looking pretty good. It is more in the range of kind of warm. So I could decide, well, maybe do I want to cool that down just a little bit? No, maybe do I want to come even, more yellow Probably not. So it's probably going to stay pretty close to where it was shot at. And again, I can play around with this and not feel like, oh, I'm going to mess it all up, because again, I can always come back to as shot. So once I've got that, then, I'm going to start with probably exposure, right? And I think the exposure overall is pretty good. If I go darker, it might give me a little bit in those highlights or make it a little moodier. If I go brighter, it's definitely going to start losing any detail inside of these highlights here, which I definitely don't want to do. So I'm going to come back to pretty close to where it was shot, maybe just brighten it a hair. And then, so again, I would like maybe a little bit more detail back here in these shadows. So I'm going to go over here, and again, I'm going to brighten up the shadows just a smidge, and then bring the blacks back down a little bit to maintain some of that contrast. I'm going to go ahead and bring up clarity, earlier than I did last time, just to go ahead and give it that sharpness and that texture that I wanted. And then that way, if it does affect the contrast a little bit, I can know what that's looking like. I'm going to hit Z really quick just to kind of zoom in and look at what's happening inside of here. I'm going to open back up those blacks a little bit and see what kind of detail we start gaining in that in those trees. Is there more in there? Looks like maybe it can bring down clarity just a little bit. It's kind of chunking up in there. And then again, I'll hit Z and pull back out of there. With the highlights, so I might want to bring down highlights a little bit and probably losing a little bit of value in those areas. If you look at the histogram, we can see these shadows are kind of blocked up there. So I'm going to look here and go, well, with highlights, I can make it a little brighter or a little bit darker. But so it will give me quite a bit more texture and detail inside of that roof area. So I do like that, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that there. I am going to bring probably whites up a little bit just so that reflection on the windshield here can be nice and bright, so I have a little bit more contrast. Let's bring those shadows back up a little bit more. And then, so at this point, if we want to look at the overall, what's that difference between the vibrancy and the saturation? So again, if I take saturation out, black and white. If I take vibrancy out, though, oops, grab it. Not black and white, right? You can see this time a little bit more that there's definitely still green and there's still reds in here, but most of the blue has gone away, right? So that's kind of that difference between the vibrancy and the saturation. So, I might want something that's a little bit more muted. Obviously, these reds are pretty strong. I could bring that red up more, but I could kind of mitigate that, a little bit by taking down the saturation of it. So, just kind of knocks it back, makes it feel a little more, vintage or old-timey, as opposed to, this really, bright, oversaturated color that, may be a different direction, but for me, that's, whoa, way too crazy. So, if I bring up the saturation, again, I could also bring down vibrancy. That's going to start dropping out those blues. If I didn't want the blue, if I saw that the blue, in here as being distracting, and I really wanted to focus on those yellows and reds, well, I could, bring the vibrancy down and then still, increase saturation even more, which is going to give me a lot of this green, and, it's dropping down the red, and I've lost some of that blue. So again, I can see, what are my differences there. Okay. So a lot of it's just kind of playing around, taking some time, looking at the pictures, getting them the area, the way that you want them to look. And then, again, if you're in the develop mode, you can always toggle back and forth before, and it shows you up here at the top, it shows before, and then, that's my adjustment that I've made. So go ahead and go through all the pictures. I want you to look at each one of those. I want you to make some amount of adjustment to them to enhance the photo. Once you've gone through all those pictures, then go ahead and re-export them. So I'm going to go ahead and do Command A in here. I'm going to switch back into my library, and then I'm going to say Export. And then once I've done the export, I'm going to go ahead and it's going to a specific Weebly upload. So this is going to be midterm, and then this is modified. And so again, I'll just double check, 100%, 2000 pixels, export. And so that'll then take these pictures, get them out of Lightroom, and move them into my Weebly upload folder so that I can actually upload those to Weebly. And then on your Weebly page, what I want you to do is to create, on the home page, create a midterm portfolio. So what you'll do is, show kind of maybe a title that says, rule of thirds, and then the two pictures, the before and the after, along with a couple of sentences that say, this is how rule of thirds works. So I place the subject at one of the four intersections created by horizontal and vertical lines and their intersections, or whatever it is you want to say about what that is, okay? But it'll be a good way for us to start to review and start to look at how, how our pictures are doing and to learn some new skills and how to develop.